Hello class, today we are going to begin discussing the Cold War. The Cold War comes almost immediately after World War II. The reason it's called the Cold War is because unlike most wars, there was no actual combat that took place. It was a long, drawn-out conflict of information, scare tactics, and near-war events between the United States and the Soviet Union, for the most part. So let's begin. The Cold War is really a rivalry between the US and the Soviet Union. It was more of a competition between the two superpower countries that emerged after World War II. It was called the Cold War because there was no actual fighting that took place, mainly threats and trying to be better than the other country. This doesn't mean that there wasn't scary times that happened during this period of time, but nothing actually materialized. Remember, this is right after the atomic bomb was dropped after World War II, and the whole world was worried that it would happen again. So imagine two people that want to one up each other. They're always competing, always trying to be better. And so that's what this Cold War is all about. It's about threats, spying, trying to be better than the other country. The basic issue of the Cold War comes down to ideas. In America, we were about democracy. Think about Alexis de Tocqueville and his values. We were about, and still are about, the people. We're all about the people. We're about liberty, individualism, capitalism. We're about whatever situation you're born into, that doesn't mean you have to stay that way. And it's all about your individual will to accomplish what you want in life. The Soviet Union, on the other hand, and communism are exactly the opposite. In communism, the government is in charge. These two different ideas, democracy and communism, was the root of this conflict of the Cold War. This chart shows some of the main differences between our democracy in America and the communism in the Soviet Union. So let's look first at the column with democracy, and then for each category we'll look at the Soviet communism as well. So in America, that's America, we are all about having multiple parties, multiple views in which our leaders can be elected from. Now, we basically have two main parties today, the Democrats and the Republicans, but that doesn't mean other parties can't rise up. But the idea is that you have multiple parties with different ideas. In the Soviet Union, there's only one party, the Communist Party, and that's it. In economics, for democracy, you receive and keep what you earn. Your business is successful, then you get to keep that successful um, money from the business. The government, for the most part, stays out of your way. That's where we get that laissez-faire, no laissez-faire things. There's more restrictions today than there were in the past, but for the most part, you can do what you want to do. In communism, you give what you have to the government. So if you plant more crops and harvest more crops than your neighbor, it doesn't matter. You don't get to keep that. You have to give that to the government, and then they decide what you get back. Now, some things that were provided without cost to the people in communism were education and healthcare, and that could be a good thing, but the problem with that is, say you are a doctor and you get paid the same amount of money if you see one patient or 100 patients, you're not going to be very motivated to work that hard. But in America, if you get paid on the amount of patients that you take care of, well, you're going to try to work harder so that you can get more money. So there's pros and cons to both of the economic systems, but for the most part, here in America, most would agree that capitalism, or that free enterprise, which shows up right there, well, free enterprise is a good idea, and that is capitalism. So with religion, it is simple. In America, we have freedom of religion, where you can choose what you believe in, but in communism, it was really discouraged, and at times people were persecuted for their religion and their religious beliefs. In democracy, you have basic individual rights, such as our First Amendment rights of speech, religion, press, assembly, and so forth, while in communism, you could actually be arrested for speaking out against the government. Newspapers in America can pretty much print what they want without consequences, but newspapers in the Soviet Union would be censored to where the government actually tells them what to print. And then finally, with organizations in America, it's set up to where you can have unions. Those are labor unions, so that if working conditions are bad, you and your union can speak up and work with your employer to fix that. That's what happened during the Progressive Era. Think of Upton Sinclair and the Jungle, which passed laws and labor unions to make things better for workers. But in communism, there's only the Communist Party, and they really didn't care about your complaints, because remember, if you complain, you could get arrested. So there are some main differences between the two ideas of government, and you can see these basic differences and ideas. So the main man in charge of the Soviet Union at the time of World War II and until the mid-1950s was Joseph Stalin. Now, Joseph Stalin was the leader of the Soviet Union, and he wanted to create this class society that helped all workers, but what we know him as today and what he turned into was this ruthless dictator. We often think of the horrible genocide that Hitler and the Nazis did to the Jews during the Holocaust, but Stalin actually killed more people. During the 1930s, Stalin sent many to be executed, imprisoned, or to a place called a gulag, which was a work camp. Like a concentration camp or an internment camp as we did to the Japanese Americans, but these camps were in the freezing below zero Siberia where tens of millions died. So even more people died with the hands of Stalin than even the Jews. And you could be sent to these gulag camps or executed or imprisoned even with or without evidence. If Stalin didn't like you, you would be sent there. So we see this little, we call this a meme over here. That was pretty much true. You're funny, you're making fun of me? Well, guess what? You're going to that gulag in Siberia. So same thing with my class. You mess with Mr. DeWitt, you're going to the gulag. Just kidding. I would never do that to you. But you get the picture with Joseph Stalin. So one thing that we already discussed as we ended World War II was one conference called the Yalta Conference. And that was held in February of 1945. The big three of the Allied forces, FDR, Franklin D. Roosevelt, Winston Churchill of Britain, and Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union, met in a place called Yalta. And there they kind of worked on an agreement of how to end the war in Europe and what would happen to post-war Europe. So they agreed on the formation of the United Nations. So I have that there in red. Maybe I'll put that underline or circle it here in yellow. The United Nations is similar to that League of Nations that was created after World War I. The difference is this was much stronger. The United States backed it. And so if a country actually violated a term that was against the United Nations, they could actually be held accountable for breaking that term. So we talked about the Nuremberg trials after World War II, where Nazi officials were actually tried for their war crimes. That was done because of the United Nations. Next, we have a plan that would show how Germany would be divided. Again, they were split up into 4 different parts, as we discussed earlier. That free nations, especially in Eastern Europe, would have free elections. They'd be able to elect a president or a leader, whoever they wanted. And that Stalin even agreed to let Poland have free elections, and Poland is right next to the Soviet Union. They're pretty much neighbors. So that's what was agreed upon in the Yalta Conference. But in the Potsdam Conference, Stalin basically kind of went back on what he agreed during this Yalta Conference. So they are in agreement at the Yalta Conference, but at the Potsdam Conference, they disagree on things. So right after these types of conferences to agree on what was going to happen, one of the things that the Yalta Conference set up was that if we look at the map here, and let me get a color that should work. We look at this map here, those parts in green, those were going to be the countries that were going to be set up with free elections. Well, what happens is Stalin goes back on that decision, And fearful of the capitalism, the democracy in America, they didn't want that to spread to those countries that were near the Soviet Union. So where it says USSR, that is the Soviet Union. So you have countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, all those countries are right next to that. They didn't want free elections. They wanted to make sure that those countries would be controlled by them. So what they did is they set up these satellite nations, that's that turn in green, and it was basically these countries that that were kind of like a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the rest of Western Europe. And so what the Soviets did is they took over everything in this country. They got rid of any free elections that were going to be possible, and they basically controlled these European nations. In a famous quote, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of Britain, said that the Soviet Union had set up an iron curtain that was now over Eastern Europe. So it basically cut off Eastern Europe away from the free West, away from democracy. So as the Soviet Union shows that they're not going to work with Western civilizations, democratic civilizations, and really once they take over those Eastern European countries, the Americans come out with this policy called containment. And as you see with that second bullet point, containment was stopping the spread of communism to free democratic nations, but not fighting it in nations where there was already communism. So basically, any country that was a democratic country, if the threat of communism was coming to that country, that maybe a communist government might rise up, might take over that free democratic nation, well, the United States would kind of try to step in and make sure that that nation would stay democratic and not become communist. So that little picture there on the right with the octopus in the world was kind of showing that communism was spreading everywhere, that it's kind of wrapping its tentacles around the world. So as Americans, we need to stop that. So the Truman Doctrine comes from President Harry S. Truman. Remember, he's the president that takes over after Franklin D. Roosevelt dies right before the end of World War II. And he comes out with this policy called the Truman Doctrine, which says that any time a communist type of government through rebels threatens to take over a country, that America is going to step up and offer military aid and economic aid to make sure that those countries do not become communist. The first couple of countries that had this threat with communist rebels is Greece and then Turkey. And so what President Truman says is that for these countries, we're going to offer military aid, economic aid. Truman, he didn't want to do the same thing that Britain and France did after, or right before World War II. When World War II was coming about, Hitler was kind of trying to force the hand with Britain and Britain and France did something called appeasement. That word just basically means as they tried to, kind of give some of Hitler's demands and hoping that he would back off from his other demands. Well, Truman didn't want that. He wanted to make sure that communism stopped spreading to any other countries, and so he promised these countries that were being attacked by communist rebels that the United States would come to their aid. So after World War II, which was such a devastating war, there were reports in total, including the United States, that there were about anywhere from 30 to 70 million people that died. A majority of those people did die in Europe, and a lot of that includes civilians. Many buildings were destroyed, cities completely wiped out, and so Europe was destroyed. There was no food, they were hungry, and so one idea and one thought that came to President Truman and many Americans was that we need to rebuild Europe, because if the economic conditions and life is really miserable in Europe, that could be a perfect opportunity for the communists to come in and spread their ideas. That's what happened after World War I, is that Germany was in such a bad shape, especially with the Great Depression, that Hitler and his ideas really made sense to those poor people. So Truman did not want that to happen. So there's something called the Marshall Plan from 1948 that comes from the Secretary of State George Marshall. Remember, he's the guy that was a big advisor to the war for Franklin D. Roosevelt in World War II. He comes up with a plan to help these poor European nations after the war. So Secretary of State George Marshall, he believed that sending financial aid and money, well, that's what financial aid is, to these European countries that were destroyed after war would help not only the United States, but help all of Europe. And so in World War I, as I just mentioned, Germany was treated very badly, and that left a very, very bitter feeling in the minds of the Germans that allowed Hitler to rise up. So what we wanted to do was we gave money to places like Germany and Italy. Those were the bad guys during World War II to help rebuild those nations and so that they could thrive economically. Well, this plan was very successful in not only rebuilding Europe, but it also continued to provide jobs for many Americans and really benefited the American economy. So that right after World War II, yeah, there was a little bit of economic problems, but we really hit the ground running. And part of that was because we kept a lot of that war production going to help rebuild Europe in 1948. And this is known as the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan is just this plan to rebuild Europe by sending money over there to recreate the buildings and provide food for those Europeans that were devastated by the war. So now let's wrap up the beginning of the Cold War. So the Cold War is between the US and the Soviet Union. It's really between the different ideas of democracy and communism. After World War II, the Soviet Union takes over many Eastern European countries, pretty much breaking the agreement that was laid upon after some of the conferences, and there were no free elections in those Eastern European countries. In response, the United States comes out with that policy of containment, which is to keep communism away from free or democratic nations. Part of that containment policy was the Truman Doctrine, which said that the United States would provide military and financial aid to countries that were in threat of being taken over by communists. And finally, the Marshall Plan is the rebuilding of the war-torn Europe to make sure that we don't have the same problems that came after World War I.